Okay, so we've done a lot of work in deriving the IS curve, so now our job is to obtain a macroeconomic equilibrium. The idea is that by using a simultaneous model that reflects the fact that everything happens at once, we're able to obtain equilibrium values for certain core macroeconomic variables. Those variables are the output gap, the interest rate, and we'll be doing this by combining the IS curve and monetary policy. But then we're also going to get the inflation rate, and we're going to be using the Phillips curve, and then we're going to be extending our model to obtain information about the equilibrium values in the real sector, and that includes both the real exchange rate and net exports, and we'll be using the parity condition and the net export equation to get us this information. We have a job. We now need to combine what we know about the goods market, that's in the IS curve, with the other things that we know about monetary policy. So our equilibrium is going to reflect output and interest rates that are mutually consistent in both the goods market and in central bank monetary policy. So what we're going to need to do is express monetary policy in the same space that our goods market is expressed in. That's output gap and real interest rate space. And we don't have that yet. So our goal ultimately to get there will be an RR schedule. This is a real interest rate schedule that reflects monetary policy, and it's going to be in output gap on the horizontal axis and real interest rate in the vertical. How do we do this? Let's go back and revisit some familiar relationships, the Taylor rule and the Phillips curve. Now remember, the Taylor rule, that's sort of what guides us, what guides the central bank. And one of the key features of the Taylor rule is that when inflation or inflationary expectations rise, it needs to raise the interest rate. It needs to reduce demand because its goal is to stabilize prices. And higher demand means higher cost and hence higher prices. And that information is reflected right here in the Phillips curve, because we also learned that according to the Phillips curve, when demand increases the output gap, that increases costs, and these costs are going to be passed on to purchasers in the forms of higher inflation. So now what we're going to need to do is a little bit of algebra, and I'm going to make it as simple as possible. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to substitute our Phillips curve right here into our Taylor rule. So we used to have inflation, and inflation is some function of the output gap, some other stuff. So now what we're doing is we just have a Taylor rule where we've substituted out. There's a lot of intuition here. The Phillips curve is actually a constraint for the central bank. Once again, if the central bank wants to restrain inflation, and that inflation is caused by higher demand, higher output gap, it needs to reduce that output gap. So the next step is we need to get things into real interest rate space. And all we need to do there now is take our nominal rate and subtract off it the rate of inflation again from the Phillips curve, and we'll get an equilibrium interest rate that reflects two things. It reflects what the central bank is doing in terms of monetary policy, but also it reflects the supply constraints in the economy that are summarized in the Phillips curve. The intuition here is that the real interest rate, it's the real interest rate that matters for demand, and the idea is that our central bank, if it wants to choke off demand in order to keep the price level stable, it will have to raise interest rates vigorously enough in order to affect both the nominal and the real interest rate. Put differently, if inflation goes up by 1%, the central bank needs to raise the nominal interest rate by more than 1%. That will be reflected in our upward sloping curve. So now we've put the IS and the RR curve together, and as we'll be discussing a little bit later, we're going to get an initial macroeconomic equilibrium, an output gap and a real interest rate. That equilibrium is going to be at the intersection here of the IS curve, goods market and the RR curve, monetary policy.